Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube chess channel. Today I'll be starting my coverage of Kasparov versus Deep Blue. It was the match that was played in 1997 where Kasparov ended up losing. It was a very interesting match to say the least. Kasparov lost a score of 3.5 to 2.5. So 3.5 for Deep Blue. The match had some really good games, and I'm going to show all 6 games of the match. So let's start with game 1. Kasparov has the white pieces. Kasparov opens with knight f3, the ready opening. So playing a very flexible opening move. So not his typical d4, e4 moves that we're accustomed to see from Kasparov. d5 by Deep Blue, standard, reasonable, capturing the center. g3. Kasparov goes for a fianchetto line, putting the bishop on g2. Bishop g4. So this is an interesting move already on move 2, bishop g4. Normally you would see knight f6 here, c5, knight c6, e6. Deep Blue goes for bishop g4, putting the pressure on the knight and potentially doubling Kasparov's pawns. Whether that proves to be a weakness or a strength remains to be seen. Double pawns are kind of like the double-edged sword of chess. So sometimes they can be a liability. Other times they can be quite helpful to your structure. Kasparov responds with b3. So Kasparov allows Deep Blue to take on f3 if he so chooses. And I believe Kasparov evaluated this as just fine for him, as the pawn would come here and the pawn can control e4. It would also open up the e file for a rook. And Kasparov could play the pawn to f4 at some moment, and it would open up the bishop quite nicely on the long diagonal. So Deep Blue declines doubling Kasparov's pawns and instead plays knight d7, which is an interesting move because if you look right now, Deep Blue has played 3 pieces now, all from the queen side. So he's neglected completely all king side development. So an interesting thing to note. Kasparov continues with his fianchetto on the queen side. e6. Okay, looks fairly standard, getting the bishop ready to come out to some square. Bishop g2. Okay. Kasparov goes for a double fianchetto system. Very common in the ready opening. Knight gf6. Kasparov castles. Okay, so if we were just to look at the position right now and kind of do a quick assessment, we would notice that Kasparov has no direct center control with a pawn. He doesn't even have a pawn on the 3rd rank. So he's kind of controlling the center a little bit with his bishop and knight at the moment, but very little center control, or in fact, no center control through occupation of center. Black has adopted more of a classical style of play here, controlling the center with d5 on move 1, pawn on e6, knight controlling here, and this knight is a little bit more awkwardly placed, and was definitely a move that caught my eye when Deep Blue played that. I don't think I would have considered playing that move on move 3. On move 3, I most definitely probably would have played knight f6. So, but then again, I'm not a computer, and I'm definitely not Deep Blue. Pawn c6 by Deep Blue. So creating this very strong, solid d pawn, which is defended 3 times now. So this pawn is not going to be under any pressure or attack anytime soon. d3. Okay, finally Kasparov commits a pawn somewhat to the center of the board on the 3rd. So he has a little bit of center control now. This is a very common setup in the ready opening and the King's Indian attack. Bishop d6, very logical. Getting the bishop to control, possibly an e5 push coming in the future, or a c5 push. Knight bd2, also very logical, connecting the knights. It appears that Kasparov's getting ready for an e4 push himself, or a c4 push. Castles by Deep Blue. h3. Kasparov is now asking the question to the bishop, where would you like to go? Would you like to go back? Would you like to capture? Deep Blue responds with bishop back to h5. Not ready to capture. e3 by Kasparov. So gaining more center control, but he's also put himself into a little bit of a awkward pin with the bishop being there. So just something to note there. And another thing to note is Kasparov hasn't moved a pawn to the 4th rank at all. So very peculiar, very hyper modern of him, and also very reserved. Kasparov is a very attacking, aggressive player. He likes to sacrifice material for counterplay. He likes to play very sharp lines. So this is a very different Kasparov we're seeing against Deep Blue in Game 1. So my guess would be that Kasparov is changing his style, his play style, to kind of confuse Deep Blue. Maybe take Deep Blue into uncharted territory. Let's see what Deep Blue plays. h6. Queen e1 by Kasparov, breaking the pin, and possibly e4 ideas. Finally committing a pawn to the 4th. Queen a5 by Deep Blue. I'm a little bit confused by this move when I saw it. I'm not exactly sure what the queen is planning to do from here. Just not really exerting any pressure here. Perhaps we can make the argument that the queen is helping to control over here. But other than that, we could say that the queen is helping to connect the rooks. But not much more than that that I can personally see what this queen is doing on a5. For me, if it were my move, I would probably play queen c7. However, Deep Blue played queen a5. a3 by Kasparov. So now we have this kind of hedgehog-like structure that we normally see from black in hypermodern systems. Okay. Bishop c7 by Deep Blue. This seems like kind of like a waiting move. He's kind of waiting to see what Kasparov's going to do. So there's kind of like a waiting game that's going on, as you can tell. A little bit of a confusing move, and I'm not too sure what Deep Blue had in mind. Knight h4. Kasparov is opening up the bishop here, and possibly an f4 push can be in the cards in the future. g5. So it looks like Kasparov has forced a weakness out of Deep Blue. As you can see now, Deep Blue's king it's safe, but with the pawn lunging on g5 here, Kasparov moves back. It's possible the king could be susceptible to some sort of attack. So maybe Kasparov's knight moving to h4 kind of induced this weakness. So very clever play by Kasparov. All right, e5. Okay, black has achieved a very nice ideal pawn center by move 14. Let's see how Kasparov responds. e4. Finally, by move 15, Kasparov decides to put a pawn on the 4th rank. It only took him 15 moves, but he got there. Rook e8. Knight h2. Queen to b6. So the queen to b6 move, to me, it looks like black is now wanting to stop the pawn moving to f4, f2 to f4. So that's kind of my feeling of why the queen went to from a5 to b6, is to stop this f4 idea. Deep Blue Kasparov responds with queen c1, shuffling his queen over to the other side, making space for his rook to come to e1 now, if necessary. Possibly, but I wouldn't suspect a c4 idea. a5, gaining some space on the queen side. Rook e1. So Kasparov's idea of playing queen c1 was to bring the rook to e1 and then protect the pawn. And then these rooks are also opposing each other behind pawns. Deep Blue now plays the bishop back to d6. So several moves later, the bishop is dancing back to d6. From this position, you can kind of get the feeling that this pawn is a little bit weak. And with the queen already eyeing it, Deep Blue would like to play bishop c5 to attack the pawn one more time. That's kind of the feeling you're getting from this move. Or you should be getting. Knight to f1. D takes e4. D takes e4. Now bishop c5. Attacking this pawn, which is often the weakest pawn in chess when you castle. Or not, excuse me, when you castle. When you're uncastled, but in this case, when you're castled. You often hear f2 and f7 referred to as the square of doom by Ben Feingold, as it's the only piece that defends the f2 and f7 is the king. So can be easily attacked. Kasparov plays knight's e3, so his knight just blocks the view of the queen and bishop on the pawn. Very clever play by Kasparov. Black centralizes his rook to d8. Now, we see this kind of knight maneuvering from here to here. Knights are protecting each other, so very good knight maneuvering by Kasparov. He's really holding everything together very nicely. I find that White's pieces are very harmonious, even though Kasparov is not necessarily winning at this point. His pieces are working very well together. Black's pieces, they seem to lack a certain amount of cohesion, and when we play chess, we want our pieces to work well together. So I would definitely say Kasparov's winning in that category. Pawn to g4. H takes g4. Knight takes g4. Deep Blue is on this knight 3 times. It is sufficiently defended, but just something to keep in mind. Kasparov plays f3. So now the knight has 2 choices. To go back or to exchange. Deep Blue decides to exchange, and Kasparov takes back. Now the knight is in a pin. Let's see what happens here. Bishop to e7. So Deep Blue's idea is to transfer the bishop from this diagonal now to this to the e7 square, and then over to g5. You can see he wants to play it onto g5 to pin the knight in a different way onto the queen. Kasparov breaks the pin on the knight here by stepping his king into the corner on h1, and now bishop g5. Now Kasparov has to decide what to do here. He plays rook e2, simply pushing the rook up, possibly the queen sliding behind the rook afterwards. a4, gaining space, and Kasparov closes it by playing b4. f5. So now Deep Blue is starting to go for an all-out attack. His king safety is starting to be questionable, and he's lunging now with his f-pawn. E takes f5. And now a very nice move by Deep Blue, taking advantage of the pin pawn and on the rook here. Kasparov can't take back. But Kasparov's a pretty resilient player, very resourceful player, excuse me, and he plays f4. And he says, if you want my rook, you can have it. So Kasparov plays f4, bishop takes e2, pawn takes g5. So Kasparov is down the exchange now. Knight e5, g6, bishop f3, bishop c3. Some improvement moves, just improving the position of some of your the pieces here. Queen b5, and now queen f1. Even though Kasparov is down the exchange, he feels that it would be in his best interest to trade queens. Deep blue obliges the change, and the queens are off the board. Rook takes f1, h5, king g1, possibly wanting to come up to f2, king f8, excuse me guys, bishop h3, b5, connecting his pawns. Even though all these pawns are connected, the base of the pawn chain is quite weak on c6. Very, very superficial move here by Deep Blue. King f2, king g7, and now g4. So if you notice that even though Kasparov is down the exchange, his pieces are working quite well together. This bishop, this one, his knight is very well placed here, controlling all sides of the board. And even Kasparov's king is being used as an attacking piece now. You don't really get the feeling that Deep Blue's pieces are working very well together. These rooks are here at the back, but they're not really exerting the pressure that rooks would typically exert. Let's keep on going forward, guys. King h6, rook g1, h takes g4, bishop takes g4, and bishop takes g4, and knight takes, and the knight takes. So a bunch of pieces got just traded off the board there. And now the dust has settled, and Kasparov is left with a bishop and a rook versus two rooks. However, being down the exchange, Kasparov had a plan. His plan was that I will let you take my rook, but I will end up with these very nice passed pawns. And sure enough, these passed pawns are quite powerful, and they will end up winning Kasparov the game. Rook d5, attacking the pawn. Pawn to f6. Rook d1. And pawn g7. And it was in this position that Deep Blue decided to resign the game, and Kasparov wins game 1. So, as you can tell, these pawns will promote either to g8 or f7 and then f8. Black will have to sacrifice at least one of his rooks to stop the pawns from promoting, and then it'll just be an easy win for Kasparov to clean up the rest of the pieces on the board. So that's it for game 1. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed seeing another different playstyle from Kasparov, playing very reserved with a King's Indian attack with a double fianchetto system. And I thought it was very interesting how Kasparov had all of his, he had pawn a3, b3, d3, e3, g3, and h3. He didn't commit any pawn to e4, d4, c4, f4 until move 15. He finally committed a pawn to e4. So it's definitely a very different style of play, very hyper-modern, that you would normally see on the black side of the pieces in perk defense, modern defense, and defenses like that, hedgehog, hippopotamus defense. Sorry, a lot of funny names in chess. Yes, chess has very funny names for openings. But that's the game. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as me. And that's it for the video for today. And I wish you all the best, guys, and have a good night.